Hello, and welcome to Nomadic Diaries, the re-entry series. I'm Doreen Cumberford, the host.
And I'm Linda Mueller, the co-host.
So hi, everybody. Welcome. Linda Mueller is here as my co-host. Hi, Linda.
Hi, everyone.
And we're so excited that we have Polly Collingridge from the Cultural Intelligence Centre in London with us. And Polly is the account manager there. And welcome, Polly. Thank you so much for coming back to Nomadic Diaries to talk about repatriation.
Thank you, Doreen. Linda, it's lovely to be here again. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, I consider you one of the voices in the repatriation circle who actually has the intelligence and the head experience of working with something like cultural intelligence, but also has the embodiment and the heart of the subject of repatriation because you've lived through it. Could you tell us a little bit about your expat repat experience to start with?
It was a while ago now, but it does live long in my memory. I was an expat. I lived in California for 3 years with my husband and our 2 small kids. After those 3 years, we came back to London, and I was surprised to find that the experience was genuinely more difficult, firstly, than I'd anticipated. But really, when I look back, I would say that I found it much more difficult even than the original kind of expatriation experience, the kind of, original kind of adjustment to the US culture.
Interesting. And can you tell us in what parts of this were surprising and difficult?
Well, I think there were various factors, and I think that different people obviously have different repatriation experiences. Not everybody has a worse experience or a difficult experience, but in my case, it didn't help that we had a bit of a quality of life downgrade. We'd been living in a lovely house in the Redwoods, with loads of outdoor space in the beautiful Californian countryside with, most of the time, the beautiful blue sky, save the occasional bit of fog. It was pretty nice. And then we came back to London, and this was particular to our circumstances, we moved back to a house that was too small for us, that we'd outgrown when we moved and had thought that we would never go back and really live in for any length of time. And we got sort of stuck there because of various circumstances that I won't go into in too much detail, but there was building work that had to happen due to a major leak of the sewage pipe. I mean, it was pretty bad. We got sort of stuck. The building work dragged on and on, covered by insurance, thankfully. But yeah, the initial couple of months back in London were involved having to live with my parents. Then we moved back into the house. There was a sort of catalogue of things going wrong with that. And for one reason or another, we ended up having to live in this tiny house for 3 years, partly because my husband was made redundant. So that he was looking for a new job. We couldn't get a mortgage. Brexit happened. House prices collapsed. It was just like you couldn't have written it. That was a specific problem that was particularly bad. But from a kind of cultural perspective, I was surprised because I had obviously been thinking of my life in London while I was in California through somewhat rose-tinted glasses. I had been imagining that the kids would go back to school and kind of fit right in, and we'd feel like we were sort of back where we belonged in terms of the school, because while we'd been in the States, I'd had a few kind of concerns about my son's schooling. I thought it seemed a little bit maybe not as rigorous as the UK education system, and I sort of felt like it was all a bit lax, and he was going to need to kind of catch up a bit in the UK. And then almost from day one, I realized that I had adjusted to the very lovely, quite sort of touchy-feely, hand-holdy experience we had in the US. And that it was really quite different. And I didn't have the kind of relationship with the kids' school teachers that I'd had in the US, where it was much more informal. They were both, I should say, both schools were in the public school system. So that was the same. But definitely I wasn't invited into the classroom. I had some concerns about his kind of emotional well-being, his mental health, and they weren't really listened to or taken into account in the same way. Now, that could also be specifically not maybe a cultural difference, whatever, but it could have been to the type of school they were. But either way, it made things quite hard. And I found that very difficult. And I realized that, that what I'd been thinking were concerns about the US school system were actually things that I had grown to really value. They had really put a lot of emphasis on experiential learning, project-based learning, and lots of sort of conversations. And that wasn't happening in the UK, which has kind of reverted back to really quite a kind of old school focus on English and maths. Lots of other subjects weren't given the time of day. And I know there are these concerns within the US school system too, but relative to here, it was a lot better. And so I was a bit thrown by that. And I realized that I had adapted and appreciated a lot of things about life in the US, not even just the school, but that was the first and one of the biggest things that I was really sad to have let go of.
I remember in another conversation that we had, you mentioned that for many people, it can be a downgrade in the quality of life. It can be a downgrade in terms of relationships and communication with professionals around us and support systems, doctors, medical. I find that in the US, coming back from Mexico, which is so one-to-one, so intimate, where your doctor actually will text me in the morning and say, what are your statistics when I had COVID? How are you feeling today? To a very, very impersonal system. So it's different from country to country and from subject to subject, right? So that's a lot to unpack. Linda, have you ever had an experience like that?
In terms of the quality of life, we've bounced in and out of the US. So the quality of life was very different. And even when we moved from Abu Dhabi, where we had a very large house, to London, where we had what was relatively large by London standards, it was a lot smaller. And it does really, you don't necessarily, it's not like in front and center a lot of times when you're thinking, but there's little things that can cause this like underlying stress, I find. You said that you were surprised by a lot of what you experienced when you got back to the UK. Were you aware of the phenomenon of reverse culture shock, or?
I was aware, and I thought I had prepared for it, and it still was more than I thought. So, the house thing, I knew from the outset that I didn't want to go back there, and I was already kind of somewhat dreading that. The other thing, I think the cultural thing surprised me more, because I think that's something that's very difficult to sort of experience until you're experiencing it. Like, I think that awareness of how much you've adapted only really kicks in when you're in a different environment. There were other things too, like it was funny, sort of texting other mums in the US, asking them for favors, can you help me with the school run, that kind of thing, or whatever it was. At first, when we moved out there, I was very struck by what seemed like quite a direct style of communication, quite kind of just, Polly, call me, or Polly, can you do this for me? And I was a bit like, oh, that feels quite, a little bit rude to my kind of British ears. But then when it was so funny, when I moved back and I started seeing all the texts and sending again the texts to my friends here, they seemed overly wordy and a little bit insincere with their overly politeness. And I thought, how interesting. Now I'm seeing my own culture through different eyes. And she doesn't even like me that much. She doesn't have to be quite so obsequious or whatever. It just felt like, it just felt interesting to see what, to realize how there's a sort of probably a middle way, and you can kind of, depends where you're standing as to how you interpret something.
Well, it's interesting that you're mentioning friends. I think that makes me question, like, has your friendship group shifted since you've been back? Are you friends with other people with international experiences? Like, why don't you give us a little bit of insight on that?
I think my friendship group didn't shift. There were maybe a couple of people who I'm less friends with than from before I went, but really I do tend to seek out people who've had international experiences since having had more of my own. I think that was a really important part. In fact, one of the things that really helped me to kind of overcome my sort of reverse culture shock was I became friendly with an American woman whose daughter was the same age as mine, who was living in London. In fact, she still lives here. And although I now don't live so close to her, and our kids aren't so close, so we don't see her so much, but at the time she was this quite a kind of lifeline person for me, because she was living my experience in reverse. She'd moved to London. And I realized that really helped me. And I think it helped my daughter too, because she had a friend who sounded like her friends from the US. And so she was really unfazed by that, and liked going around to their house. And one time they invited us over for like a Thanksgiving meal. And, that was actually really nice. Yeah, I think one of the things talking about friends that can be hard, and I'm sure you'll relate to this as well, is the fact that you just are so full of all of your experiences when you come back, and there's a limit to how much they really want to hear about them. And they literally just want to have one conversation on your first time you meet up, and then don't really want to hear about it again. And that's just really difficult because this has been 3 years of your life that have been so formative, for you, for your kids. And it's actually shaped a little bit how you now see the world to some degree. And it's really difficult to kind of communicate that to them without getting the sense that you're maybe being a bit irritating somehow and you don't
Right.
quite know why, but you know that you are.
Yeah, like,
Because they've not
do
had
they
those
think,
experiences.
right? Do they think I'm bragging? Or I've gotten really good at watching for, the eyes glazing over, and then I know it's time to redirect the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
there was definitely that.
it's very important, I think, to save your stories for a moment when you think that they can actually deliver some impact rather than just be a recounting for our own mental health. but
Yeah.
but both are sometimes can be really valuable. So you did your master's degree examining some au pairs from Scandinavia, which I thought was such a fascinating. I read the whole thing. I'm not sure I understood and took it all in, but it was absolutely fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit about just the top line conclusions you gained and from this small group of people?
Sure. So actually, they were au pairs. It was around just over 100 au pairs from a number of different countries. From memory, I think quite a few of them were from Germany, but there were definitely also some
Yes.
from several other different countries. And I wanted to find out whether their sort of sense of cultural identity had an impact on their amount of reverse culture shock when they came back. So my theory was that perhaps if your sense of cultural identity shifts to be more sort of associated with the host culture, then you might feel more distress on your repatriation than if you didn't. And that would be explained by the extent to which you kind of adapted or not, like how acculturated you were. And I wasn't quite able to kind of prove my full hypothesis, but I did prove that the more you had adapted, the weaker your home cultural identity was, and the stronger your repatriation distress was. But I couldn't prove that acculturation sort of caused weaker home culture identity and therefore greater repatriation distress, because that was my whole kind of original hypothesis. And the other thing I had hypothesized was that if the culture was really different that you went to stay in, then you might acculturate or adapt less. Therefore, you would retain a stronger sense of home culture identity and be less distressed on your return home. But I couldn't quite prove that. In fact, it seemed to be that I found the opposite, which was intriguing. But I'd need to do a longer study to kind of find out why that was. Because so that hypothesis came out of the fact that I thought, well, I adapted quite well to the US culture and to my life in California. Maybe that's because the cultures are quite similar ultimately. Like perhaps if I'd gone to Japan or somewhere very, very different, then maybe I wouldn't have. But then I suppose then the added thing with that is that you might, and in many places like Dubai, for example, Linda, I'm imagining you probably stay within a sort of expat community more than kind of, acculturating into the kind of home culture a lot. Whereas in the US, I did do that because I wasn't within a kind of community of Brits necessarily. Because of the language, that didn't stop me, and the similarity of the cultures, it didn't stop me integrating quite a lot.
That's a really good point because in the UAE, there's more expats than locals. So that's definitely an outlier, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's interesting. I mean, you'd need to do lots more research on it. And with bigger populations, I only had 100 or so au pairs. I tried to choose au pairs because I was inspired to do that because my mother worked for many years for the American Institute for Foreign Study, and she was one of the directors of the Au Pair in America program. So I knew I could, through that, sort of get access to au pairs and ask them. And also I had the idea that I wanted to retain some sort of, what's the word, consistency as to what these people had done when they were abroad. And I wanted them to have had some sort of full immersion experience, which living with a family would have been, rather than just being a student.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Talking about research, Linda and I have been having some conversations since we've been doing this series on repatriation about my perennial 15-year-long love of this subject and the lack of research. And so tell us about what you've been looking into as relates to your new role in the cultural intelligence field.
Yeah, so I completely agree with you. There's very little research out there on repatriation. And I was also curious to see what there was in terms of cultural intelligence and repatriation. And the answer is very little. There's a lot on cultural intelligence and expatriation, as you would imagine. Cultural intelligence being the ability to relate to and work effectively alongside people who are culturally different to you. But I did find out a little bit. I found one particular study. It was a master's dissertation paper from a student, a Portuguese student, interestingly, in 2021, who found that CQ strategy, as one of the 4 capabilities of cultural intelligence, was positively related to readjustment and job adjustment. So CQ strategy is the kind of planning, checking and revising your assumptions, sort of part of that, of the capability of cultural intelligence. So the ability to do that is obviously important in terms of job adjustment. And the other thing I found was that CQ knowledge, which is your knowledge about how cultures are similar and different, is also important to the repatriate's job adjustment. And that's explained by the relationship between CQ knowledge and having the opportunity to apply those skills that you've learned abroad when you come back. So if you have the opportunity to apply those skills and to sort of exercise your newfound CQ knowledge, then you can end up having a more satisfying job experience on your return, which makes complete sense to me, because I think that we all want to feel a sense of purpose, and we all want to kind of learn and grow. And some other studies that I found showed that developmental relationships are really important in achieving successful expatriation and repatriation sort of outcomes. And from a psychological definition perspective, a developmental relationship is one that allows people to grow in self-discovery, cultivate new skills, and learn how to engage with and contribute to the world around them. So I feel like, again, that makes total sense with the other study about CQ strategy, because it would suggest that, and CQ knowledge, which would suggest that, jobs that allow people to do that, to kind of grow and learn and show what they've learned, are going to be better for people in terms of their well-being, in terms of their outcomes.
Definitely. And I, a lot of people talk about these hidden skills that we grow as expats. I think of them as sort of invisible superpowers in a way. And, I've been asking people at the end of some of the episodes, so what do you think, what superpower do you think we get? But in order to make that serious, in order to give that some weight, we have to have some information in order to translate it into actual difference. Because I think that, they used to call these soft skills, and now people are saying the soft skills are now the hard skills. And these are invisible hard skills. So how can we help our people who are repatriating to articulate this? I mean, how do you you can't exactly put on your resume, well, I've got these 3 superpowers. So how do we help people who are coming back actually articulate that in a way that makes a difference?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not sure. I think you can try and put them on your CV or your resume, but it's not easy. I think you have to somehow be able to articulate the fact that you are culturally intelligent, or that you've learned cultural intelligence, and that you understand the connection between kind of belonging and a sense of well-being and your own productivity and performance as a result of all of that. I think, if we think about what, and it's not quite the question you asked me, but if you think about what employers can do to help people, I think they need to educate themselves too. I was thinking about it. I think that if you're a multinational company that sends people overseas regularly, I think you need to provide better support for people who are coming back. And part of that support could look like certainly educating yourself and whoever the team of people are that they're going to be working with to recognize, what you need to do if you're in terms of sort of keeping in touch with people who are abroad and understanding what they're doing and how they've, what skills they're learning and how those skills can really benefit them when they come back, and make sure that they are in a role that allows them to exercise their flexibility, their self-awareness, their flexibility, whatever those the various elements of cultural intelligence that they will have gained. I think you've got to be self-aware, you've got to be adaptable, you've also got to be patient to some degree, all of the things that an expat has to sort of exercise, suspending judgment and keeping an open mind and being curious and all those sorts of skills. I think those are the sorts of skills you need in reverse to some extent, but I think it is harder because of the unexpected nature of it. And I think part of the reason why it's unexpected is because you expect to belong and you don't. And so that is really difficult. So I think, being made aware that you probably will feel that you don't belong at first. That's one thing. But another thing is being a bit more supported by having the people around you, such as, say, your employer or the team of people you're working with, expecting you to feel like that, having been told that you probably will, and trying to kind of anticipate it and troubleshoot it and support you. Like, how amazing would that be? I don't think it happens very often.
Yeah, and I love the idea of having it articulated on your resume somehow. But I'm wondering, when people go through the cultural intelligence training, do they come out with a badge that says, I'm culturally intelligent? I mean, how do we go out into the world and actually behave, act, communicate, and be in alignment with this concept?
I mean, there is no badge, partly because the journey is never done, right? Like, you're never fully culturally intelligent, so it doesn't work like that. I suppose it was a bit trite what I said, but I think I was trying to say you've been using and you've grown and you've developed your cultural intelligence, and you somehow want to kind of show that or be able to use that in your job. So there is no badge, I think. And because, of course, also you can be culturally intelligent in one situation and really not so much in another, because we all have cultures that are easier to adapt to, or, than others, and sort of blind spots about some kinds of cultural difference. So, yeah, I don't know.
No, I just tossed that out because I was just curious about that. Linda, do you have a question?
Well, I think it would probably be helpful for listeners to give some sort of a context to say what the statistics are, because I was surprised to see myself the number of people that actually end up switching jobs within the first year or two after they've repatriated. And, we've already mentioned that the statistics are a bit challenging, but the numbers I've seen is within the first year, somewhere between 30 and 40% of employees that have had an expat experience leave. And then within the second year, it's 50 to 60%. Has anybody heard anything different or that you want to share?
And no, I mean, I found figures which I believe date back to sort of pre-COVID. I found some PricewaterhouseCoopers figures from 2018 that cite 44% of people quitting within 2 years of returning from an overseas assignment. And then I found some other stats from the International HR Advisor, which is from an article called Repatriation, the Real Costs, that said 20% would leave within 9 months and 50% within a year, with 60% reporting their company didn't communicate about what they were to face on repatriation. 75% felt their role at home was a demotion. And
Definitely.
60% felt their increased cultural agility and other new skills went unrecognized, which kind of goes alongside everything that we've just been saying. It would be really interesting to see sort of post-COVID figures. I do think that there's a move, and I'd be curious to know what you've found in your conversation so far. I think there's a move towards recognizing that you've got to be a bit more holistic in your kind of repatriation support, maybe at least on paper, if not in practice. The feeling that actually, guess what, well-being is related to performance, and we have a bit of a duty of care with people coming back. I think during the COVID periods and the lockdown period specifically, I think that was maybe more at the forefront of people's minds. I don't know whether it's kind of eased off a bit.
I think it's morphing all the time. I actually had a conversation with someone who was advertising executive with a big company like Saatchi & Saatchi, an American living in London, now friend and colleague of mine in San Miguel de Allende, who was just discussing, the amount of talent that he actually advises advertising agencies and the amount of talent that still walks out the door. And that is a very talent-driven industry. And of course, the industry is changing. So there's a lot of questions of how much of it is just the pace of life and the digitization and the streaming that has changed our lives, or how much is being done. But, people like that are still asking the questions. I'm just not sure where we can get definitive answers, because we know that it's different everywhere and it's different for every single industry. Every sector has its own challenges. Now, I talked to two people last week who were in China and then left once in absolute upheaval, and another one, it was a planned repatriation. So, but that planned repatriation, even having done it before, being an expert in the industry, being a trainer, was still a mess.
Mhm.
So I think it's very curious to talk to people who have all different levels of experience in this, who talk about how messy it can be. And I think our main message here is just for people to just fasten your seatbelts and be prepared.
Yeah, absolutely.
So have you seen any changes in terms of how companies address this issue with, I would assume through your work that you're in touch with a lot of companies that are wanting to address these types of issues with employees, but have you seen any changes in terms of the level of support that they're willing to give employees as they're repatriating?
Actually, well, through the Cultural Intelligence Centre here in the UK, we don't do too much at the moment in terms of global mobility work, although we'd certainly like to, because I feel like one of the things that we would really advocate for would be developing the cultural intelligence of people who are, say you're an expat and you've been sent off somewhere to go and work in a team in Singapore. We would advocate that the Singaporean team also develop their cultural intelligence and went through similar training to sort of receive you and be in a good place to receive you. But in terms of sort of changes, I think that generally speaking, maybe there is a bit more family related support. I think people assumed perhaps, oh, you're going back to your home country, you're fine. You don't know, you know the school system, you're probably going to move back to a house you already own, but that's just not always the case. And before I worked for the Cultural Intelligence Centre, I did some intercultural training work for the DSFA, who are the sort of family membership support arm of the Foreign Office in the UK. They were very keen to, especially post-COVID, to provide more support for their families, because they realized that, especially with COVID, they were sometimes coming home unplanned, as you referred to, Doreen. That can be really unsettling to people. Their house was rented out.
Yes.
And so they had to find another house and find another school. And of course, if you find another house and it's not near the school your kids would slot back into, or maybe your kids have grown up and they're now, at high school rather than primary school. So you actually have to start again. You can't just assume that you know everything. And actually, it's massively time consuming sorting all of those things out. And it's not always easy to do that. And so actually, one of the things that makes life smoother if you're an expat is quite often that sort of thing is sorted out. You receive assistance on that. And I think not to assume that just because you're coming home, you can just do it all yourself, because you don't necessarily have any more time to do that coming back. and you might also really welcome assistance. And then, let's say there's two people coming home, it's a family, and one of them has a job and one of them doesn't. They may still really appreciate career coaching, extra support, that sort of thing. I wonder whether that's offered in the same way that it is if you're overseas. Not sure, but I think that those would be nice changes. Whether they're happening or not, I'm not certain.
I'm not sure if you know Angie Weinberger, but she is she's on LinkedIn, and she has been on Nomadic Diaries, and she is an expert in global mobility and who is constantly talking to managers in HR about the humanizing of the processes, because although we've become perhaps more aware of the support that is necessary, the way that it is delivered and the way that it is served up can often be excruciating. And she talks about stories like a family arriving in the middle of a night to a destination, to a new home, to come to, standing out in the rain at 4 o'clock in the morning with their kids to get into some accommodation, and they don't have the proper codes, and everything is done so electronically that they had a person to call, but nobody answered the phone. And there are situations like that happening frequently. I think it's just important to talk about repatriation because all of these things, we've heard the horror stories, and
totally. I think that the humanizing of the process is exactly the right way of going about it, because it's not good to you can't just outsource this to a kind of out of hours email that nobody's checking or whatever it is, it's
exactly.
And often there are children involved, and I think there needs to be perhaps still a greater recognition of the fact that you're not able to function and work effectively if your basic needs of sort of home and shelter and kind of and all of that is sort of feels like they're under threat, and your kids are all over the place.
Sure.
And it can be ridiculously stressful, especially with children, if they don't have sort of school places and all of that sort of thing. And you can't underestimate how much that impacts, even if the person that you're employing is, in your eyes, not the primary caregiver. Does not mean to say that they're not, and they may be, but even if they aren't, it doesn't mean to say that it's not going to impact on them, this sort of upheaval. So it just makes common sense when you think about the amount of money that is lost when people leave after, say they've left after in their first year or the 2 years, those stats we were reading. I mean, those are huge figures. I mean, that's actually how cultural intelligence, that was one of the reasons why Lynn Van Dyne, our CEO, was so interested, because she was working in HR for an American company based out in Singapore. And she was intrigued at that point, how come some people were able to adapt to their new life in Singapore, and other Americans, these were kind of sending home for Cheerios and peanut butter, things that I'm sure you can get in Singapore now, but at the time you couldn't. And so that was really kind of the springboard for her research, because the company didn't want to lose money with all these people leaving. So that was the opposite. That was, expats leaving early. But the point is that whether it's an expat or a repat, a huge amount of money is spent on trying to hire somebody new.
Exactly. And it's costing the corporations a lot of money if they're large corporations. But what about, since COVID, it seems like we've had all different kinds of expatriation. Now we're having more digital nomads. Now we have more smaller companies or mid-sized corporations who don't have a huge HR presence or huge HR resource. What would you say to them? How can we help raise their awareness?
I don't know how we can help raise their awareness. I think perhaps hopefully listening to podcasts like this would be a first step. I think that maybe it's difficult, isn't it? Perhaps it's on the employee from the beginning to kind of explain to them, but they're not going, they need to be able to be sure that they'll be heard. I think it's difficult because it's not as simple as just offering a lump sum of money to help anybody, because often the person who's receiving that money doesn't actually know the best way, doesn't know what's in store for them down the road, and doesn't know the best way of spending it. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know whether that's sort of not my area of expertise, but I can kind of pontificate. But I don't know whether you've heard some interesting thoughts.
No. I just noticed that there are more corporations and mid-sized corporations that are struggling with this also, or they're struggling, and there hasn't been a place to report it, to document it, to express it, or even articulate it. It's kind of the strange, which I think is why we don't have science. And I would just beg the world to please do some studies on this and some science, so we get some numbers, because I think if we understood the effects and we saw the costs, then perhaps we would have some action, and there would be some resources to offer these smaller companies.
I think, I completely agree with that sort of thinking about it. When we went to the States and came back again, that was an interesting one, because my husband was the first employee they'd ever relocated overseas in the first place. And they sorted out a few things for us, but they also just gave us a lump sum of money, which we sort of didn't know quite how best to spend. And Also were unaware. They didn't give us very good advice regarding tax. So we had suddenly got hit with a massive tax bill kind of 3 years down the line, which was really stressful and was one of the reasons why we chose to come back. And I think we were in some ways kind of digital nomads because at that point, after having been there for 3 years, for various reasons, we decided to move back. It was very much a head over a heart decision, but we thought we'll go back. And the company was still going to employ my husband, but remotely from the UK. But because it was our choice to move back, we paid for it. So we paid everything. We paid the shipping. We sorted everything out. We had literally zero help from them because they would have preferred he'd stay there. So we had the flexibility. So in that sense, we were like digital nomads at that point because they were happy for us to go back. And that's also partly what made it so hard. We spent a fortune, we paid for all the shipping going back. And then, and I tell you what, I think this is not the same question that you just asked me, but I do think it's interesting to consider the voluntary or involuntary nature and the impact that has on you when you're a repatriate. Because in our case, we were voluntary, but that doesn't actually make it easier, like I would argue, because if you go into an assignment knowing you're here for a year or here for 3, you've always got that in your head. For us, we moved out in a very open-ended way and then decided that we would move back. And it was very difficult because you have to live with a decision that you then regret. Whereas, and I had control over that situation, but I kind of, made a choice which I then regretted. Now it's quite a tough one to live with. It's also partly why I think our reverse culture shock was so hard. So I don't know what the answer is, because a company like my husband's, they weren't going to pay for us to come back, and I get why they weren't under those circumstances. But but yeah, I don't know. You just have to sort of suck it up, I suppose, if that's, if
At
you've
some
made
point,
that decision, you've got to lie in, but then that's your bed you've got to lie in, or whatever the saying is.
There's so many unknowns with a globally mobile lifestyle that we're always just making decisions based off of the best information we have at the time. And it can be so challenging. I know a few other families who were the main breadwinner was the first expat from their company, and their stories are both similar to what you just said. I think a lot of times what happens is they don't bring in expert advice. Things are not put in writing. Promises are not kept, or situations change. And so I think that's one thing I'd like to share with listeners is if you're thinking of becoming an expat, it's really important to get a lot of things in writing before you go. I mean, I've had many people reach out to me because of my coaching business, and then also just friends that know that we've lived overseas and asking questions. And the things that their companies, even if their companies have other expats, there's so many things that companies aren't willing to discuss, or I guess because they figure they can just push it over on the employee in the long run. So I think it's always important to get as much information up front as you can.
And they don't really understand the relationship between the well-being of the employee and the effectiveness and output of the employee. We had this happen in our own family after we had retired and moved back to America. Our kids, when they were out of university, our now son-in-law had an opportunity to go overseas. But the corporation, again, Linda, had never sent anyone overseas. So my husband was called in to help us write this contract. What do we need to know? And it was very simple. It was very basic. But even getting them to stretch that far was challenging. Now, I think we're coming a long way, and the world is becoming a little bit more adjusted to global mobility. But when I talk about global mobility here in the States to some people, many people still don't know what it is. It's still a foreign concept.
Well, and there's different scenarios too. Not everyone's on an expat package from a company that in their home country. Like our family's done it in all different ways. My husband has been on a corporate package with an American company, but he's also been a local hire with a company that was based in a different country. And that was a whole different scenario. And then he was in London. He was actually sort of a local hire as well, but it was because it was an American company. There was some quasi support that we wouldn't have had otherwise. But so I'm just saying all of that because I think a lot of times people think expat, you're on a big package where everything's taken care of. And even now, a lot of big companies are trying to send people overseas more as a local hire, and it's not considered a hardship. So they want you to live more like a local. So it's really important, I think, to think about all these different things before you agree to go.
And that's partly because the companies don't have the access to cultural intelligence training, so they don't know what their employees are going to be called to become.
Right. It's a good
Because
point.
Yeah, I think, there's so many things to think about. There's the sort of whole practical, logistical side. I think people tend to think about that, don't they, when you're moving?
it's
They
easy.
think of that. That's the easy bit. And yes, it can create a bit of a headache and a bit of a long to-do list, but you just sort of tick through it. But the thing that, like as you said, it's the emotional, psychological side of things that takes really takes its toll. And I think the key really is to be able to to have more science out there, more data to show the connection between your, as you say, the output or the performance and your well-being, and how the impact of a move and a big transition can impact negatively on your well-being. Because until you've got that, then you can't really convince those middle-sized companies or those small companies that it's worth spending money on a sort of that kind of hand-holding and support and advice that we're talking about is necessary. Budgets are tight, and it's not going to feel like a priority, and that's what needs to be, I think, proven or shown more.
Well, I think this has been a fascinating conversation. I love that we've sort of spoken around the edges of the challenges of this time of life. And repatriation, like, it doesn't last forever, but it does last forever in our mind's eye, and it does change us forever. And we would like to reposition it as an opportunity for what if it could be the most creative time of your life, even though it's the hardest. What if it could be the most culturally intelligent time of your life? What if? And so, do you have anything that you'd like to leave our listeners with today? One little piece of your super potential advice?
I think I love what you said about reframing it as a positive. I think that's brilliant, because I think, I'm a big fan of reframing since COVID. I feel like I got quite good at it. Okay, this seems like a really terrible thing. How am I going to put this into a positive? And I think that's the way to look at it, because actually the skills you learn as an expat are really valuable. And I think we should just big up and find a way to somehow express that, whether it's on your resume or however, because I think you need to kind of, somehow summon up a sense of confidence and pride and self-awareness about how much you've learned, and be able to communicate that in whatever way to others. So the one thing that I was thinking also is a real challenge when for people when they're repatriating is the fact that you have a sense of loss about your adventurous life abroad. I think that can be underestimated. Yeah, it is a form of grief. Mm-hmm. And I remember that I didn't quite anticipate how that would feel. I knew I'd read about reverse culture shock, but I remember when the plane landed at Heathrow, literally the wheels hit the tarmac, and it was the sort of grey outside of Heathrow, and I just suddenly felt my world close in. And I was like, I now only have one world instead of two. I loved the feeling that I had sort of two worlds I could kind of toggle between. I could come back to London in the summer, and then I could fly back out to San Francisco and have a whole life out there. And it made me feel sort of not superhuman, but I loved it. I felt like I had an access all areas pass, and suddenly like that had been partly revoked, and I was just back to being Polly in London again, and it felt really boring. And I think you have to kind of remember that, it's very hard to realize that that's how you're going to feel till that door closes off.
Was there anything that you did that helped you process that grief?
Well, for a long time, I tried to get back. Most people don't have this opportunity. When I mentioned earlier that my husband was made redundant, that was one of the reasons why we got stuck in our house. At that point, we still had green cards. And we were like, well, you just look for a job in both out there and here, and let's just see what comes up first. And really, when I finally accepted that we were not going to be moving back, that there was no choice, there was no chance of moving back, wasn't really until about a year later when he got a job in the UK, like a London-based job. So I suppose for around a year, I lived with this kind of we could still go back feeling. And so really, I don't know what helped me process it. I think, first of all, I had to accept it. And so I hadn't even reached acceptance yet for about a year. And then it was just planning for the future in London. I think you have to have something to focus on. I was doing my cross-cultural psychology masters, so I was occupying myself with that. We were looking to move house. I was thinking about schools for my kids. My son was growing up and he was going to be going to high school. I think it was just keeping busy, and finding like American friends in London. Finally accepting. But I don't know. It was just time. I'm sure you both relate to this.
Yeah,
Time is the ultimate healer. Having new grounding experiences that were valuable to me that were based in the UK, because I think I found it very difficult initially to fit into our life in California. And it wasn't really until like a full sort of all the 4 seasons have passed that you can go, I remember we were here last Halloween and we did this and now we're doing this.
Exactly.
And you feel like you belong somewhere. The same thing had to happen back in London.
The calendar does have an impact, doesn't it? When you go through a season and then you recognize it again, there's a familiarity factor. And as we spend more time in that particular circumstance, that familiarity factor builds and gives us confidence. And I think changes, that's what really sort of begins to change our inside parts, like our values and our expectations and that sort of thing. This was really helpful. And I think we don't talk enough about what you just said, Polly, about the sense of superpower that you had. Because I can remember flying back. My daughter was at boarding school in Colorado and I was in Saudi Arabia, and I would go back and forth 4 or 5 times a year, sort of a commute almost. And I remember thinking, I have 2 lives. I have this big life and I have this big life and I have these people here and I have those. And it felt empowering.
Yeah.
Only word I have for it.
When it
does feel empowering.
Sorry, Linda.
It becomes your identity, right? This is who you are, the person.
Yeah.
People that know you in both places know you as this traveler.
Yeah, 100%. And also, I liked, and I really recognize this is not always going to be the case for people, but in our case, being Brits in California between 2012 and 2015, we were positively received. People thought we were, interesting. People said to me things like, you could do anything because of your accent, which made me laugh a lot because clearly not true. But there is this assumption that you sound sort of educated and intellectual or something. And so, that's not always going to be the case. There are many people who can move to the US and very much not have that experience. And the same would be said for people coming to the UK. So I recognize that we had that privilege, but, it was quite nice to feel like everyone thought we were interesting, clever people. So to lose that is another thing where you're nothing special now back at home. You're just like everyone else,
Well, thank you, Polly. Now, how can people reach you to find out more about cultural intelligence, what it can mean to them, what it can do for them, and how it can serve them moving through their repatriation and beyond?
Well, you'll find me on LinkedIn, Polly Collingridge, but also my email address is polly.collingridge@culturalq.co.uk. And if anyone's interested in seeing the research that I found, I'd be happy to share the details with them as well.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here, Polly.
Thanks for having me. I loved the conversation.
Great. Well, this has been terrific. And this is Repatriation Diaries. Thank you so much, Polly.
No problem. Thank you.